On this Memorial Day, Mrs. Reagan and Gorbachev talked to each other about nuclear arms, while Mr. Reagan talked separately to a group of Russian dissidents. Also in Beirut, a car bomb exploded, killing 20 people and injuring at least 78 others. We'll have the details in a moment. Robert MacNeil is in Moscow tonight.
After the news summary, events in Moscow dominate the NewsHour tonight. We focus first on President Reagan's meeting with Soviet dissidents and his criticism of Moscow's record on human rights. Next, a newsmaker interview with one of the top U.S. officials at the summit, Assistant Secretary of State Roseanne Ridgway, on just what the U.S. expects in Moscow and beyond. Then, summit analysis by two Soviet experts, Stephen Cohen of Princeton University and Michael Mandelbaum of the Council on Foreign Relations. Finally, the ordinary people of Moscow speak out candidly in a documentary report on how they see Gorbachev's program to shake up their economy and society.
Funding for the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour is provided by AT&T, combining everything people like about telephones with everything they expect from computers to make everything about information easy. AT&T. Funding is also provided by this station and other public television stations, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
At the Moscow summit, the U.S. and Soviets reported some unexpected progress today on a secondary arms control matter. Only yesterday, U.S. officials were saying there was no hope of signing a small piece of the uncompleted Strategic Arms Treaty, dealing with notification of missile launches. But White House spokesman Marlin Fitzwater said late today that the two sides were coming together on this issue. And Soviet Foreign Ministry spokesman Gennady Gerasimov talked of having a draft treaty tomorrow. The president began his official day at the Kremlin for his second meeting with Mr. Gorbachev. Reporters asked the General Secretary whether he was upset that the president would be meeting dissidents later in the day.
Я не знаю, сейчас мы встречаемся.
Well, I think now we have our meeting.
Are you upset that he keeps talking about human rights, sir?
Я вчера предложил президенту эту тему более основательно рассмотреть.
Yesterday I proposed to the president that that topic should be discussed in a more substantial way.
Потому что я так чувствую, у нас складывается такое впечатление, что, наверное, мы и вы, и мы не совсем хорошо представляем реальное положение с правами человека и в Советском Союзе, и в Соединенных Штатах.
Because it is my feeling, it is my impression that probably both sides do not have a very good idea of the real situation as regards human rights in both the Soviet Union and the United States.
And if you would ask me about the meeting with dissidents, why they did that for me so that I'd feel at home.
The human rights theme was emphasized throughout the day. President and Mrs. Reagan visited a recently restored Russian Orthodox monastery outside Moscow. The president appealed for a renewal of religion in this officially atheist state.
We may hope that perestroika will be accompanied by a deeper restructuring, a deeper conversion, a metanoia, I should say, a change in heart. And the glasnost, which means giving voice, will also let loose a new chorus of belief, singing praise to the God that gave us life.
Earlier, Mrs. Reagan visited the grave and house of the Soviet
hopes.
The most dramatic event in the Reagan's day was a meeting with political and religious dissidents at the official residence of the U.S. ambassador.
In particular, I've noted in my talks here the many who have been denied the right to emigrate on the grounds that they held secret knowledge, even though their secret work had ended years before, and their so-called secrets had long since become either public knowledge or obsolete. Such cases must be rationally reviewed.
Mr. Gorbachev had his chance to respond during a dinner toast. He told his guests that the Soviets want more human contacts, but that there are limits.
But this should be done without interfering in domestic affairs
without sermonizing or imposing one's views and ways, without turning family or personal problems into a pretext for confrontation between states.
Mr. Reagan responded by thanking his host for the chance to meet so many divergent members of Soviet society.
There was more tragedy in Beirut today. A car bomb exploded in the Christian area of East Beirut. 20 persons died, at least 78 others were injured. Police said the explosion tore the front off of 8 apartment buildings. No group has yet claimed responsibility. It occurred 500 yards from an office of Lebanese President Amin Gemayel's right-wing Phalange party and 2 miles from the Muslim slums, the scene of the recent bloody fighting among rival Shiite Muslim militias. In this country, there is some presidential politics to report. Governor Michael Dukakis, the clear Democratic frontrunner, met in Boston with a group of black supporters. They came from throughout the nation, and afterwards some told reporters Dukakis will offer Jesse Jackson a major role in both the Democratic convention and the election campaign. Jackson said at a campaign stop Sunday in New Jersey that it will take both of us to win in November, both meaning him and Dukakis. The sure Republican presidential nominee, Vice President Bush, spent today in Maine talking strategy with campaign leaders and marching in a Memorial Day parade. Memorial Day parades were held in many cities and towns around the country. In Washington, the day was marked by the traditional ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery. We will close the program tonight with some thoughts about Memorial Day by our essayist, Roger Rosenblatt. That will follow Robert MacNeil's reports from Moscow on the summit and on the Russian people. We open our extended summit coverage now with a piece from a President Reagan speech, a speech the Soviets did not want him to make. He delivered it this morning at the U.S. ambassador's residence in Moscow to a group of Soviet dissidents, Soviet citizens who have not been allowed to immigrate, who are denied religious freedom, or who are active in human rights causes. It was a speech of hope and encouragement and followed statements to the president by 3 of the dissidents.
It is impossible to accept the fact that even now many political activists are not free. They're all very well known. I cannot list all of them, therefore I will list none of them. Their crime lies in the fact that yesterday they had the courage to pronounce aloud those truths which today are publicly spoken by the leadership of our country.
The government closed our schools and synagogues, executed our writers and public figures. At present, despite democratization, our lot has not improved. The government continues to deny our right to learn and teach our national language or to have access to the riches of our culture. For the entire Jewish population in this country, there is only one Orthodox rabbi. There is no Hebrew school.
Now, on the eve of the great millennium of Christianity in Russia, this gospel truth is substantiated by an unprecedented 70-year experiment, an attempt to convert our state to a country of total atheism.
A direct result of this experiment is the decline of morals, the growth of alcoholism, drug addiction and crime, and stagnation in the economy, the sciences, education, and medicine. The rebirth of our native land along the path of restructuring that has already begun is unthinkable without true freedom of religion.
There have been hopeful signs. Indeed, I believe this a hopeful time for your nation. Over the past 3 years, more than 300 political and religious prisoners have been released from labor camps. Fewer dissidents and believers have been put in prisons and mental hospitals. And in recent months, more people have been permitted to emigrate or reunite with their families. It is our belief that this is a moment of hope. The new Soviet leaders appear to grasp the connection between certain freedoms and economic growth. The freedom to keep the fruits of one's own labor, for example, is a freedom that the present reforms seem to be enlarging. We hope that one freedom will lead to another and another, that the Soviet government will understand that it is the individual who is always the source of economic creativity, the inquiring mind that produces a technical breakthrough, the imagination that conceives of new products and markets, and that in order for the individual to create, he must have a sense of just that, his own individuality, his own self-worth. He must sense that others respect him, and yes, that his nation respects him enough to grant him all his human rights.
As Robert MacNeil reported earlier, Gorbachev gave a form of response later in the dinner speech. He said his program calls for greater democracy and openness and for giving maximum freedom for people, for the individual, and for society. Next, the official business of the summit, a major newsmaker interview with Assistant Secretary of State Roseanne Ridgway, and some analysis from Moscow, both conducted by Robert MacNeil.
What are your and your colleagues' expectations for this summit?
They are expectations that aren't bounded by signed agreements, but rather the expectations of a dialogue that takes a measure of where this relationship has come over the last 3 or 4 years and where it might go. Not so easy to describe, but fundamentally it adds depth to the relationship.
Is it fair to say, as it certainly appears from the outside, that U.S. expectations for this summit have progressively diminished as the months have gone by?
It wouldn't be quite fair. Certainly the number of agreements, the prospect of a START agreement has moved into the background, but the expectation with respect to the dialogue, how the two men might cover this broad range of issues that they've been dealing with, those expectations have stayed the same, and we have no sense of those diminishing at all.
So the atmospherics have not turned less cordial because of a failure to make more progress on the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty?
They have not. They have held the same, and I think in some respects one could almost say that the fact also of the INF ratification, which might have added a bit of disappointment, that now adds something to it.
Isn't a bit of disappointment putting it very mildly?
Well, perhaps a little mildly, but we would have had a good summit without that. We'll certainly have a better summit with it.
Yeah. The National Security Advisor, General Powell, said in a briefing yesterday in Helsinki that we can expect to make some progress on START. Now, how can these two leaders make progress on START on an exceedingly complicated set of issues which have bedeviled all the people working at the lower level all these months? How can they?
There are issues in detail that certainly we wouldn't expect the leaders to get to. The experts have been hammering them out in Geneva. But they tend to group themselves in large measure around some broad issues on which the leaders can give guidance. And we have thought that perhaps at this summit on a major issue, the counting rules for air-launched cruise missiles, the leaders might be able to give an impulse in discussing concepts of the two sides, how you count, how you arrive at a system for counting those cruise missiles that's different than the system you would use for counting intercontinental ballistic missiles. That kind of discussion is appropriate at the leader level, and then it gives a push to the experts.
Are there other broad issues of principle it would be appropriate for Mr. Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev to make progress on?
I think not of principle. I really have the sense that the broad questions of principle have been handled, and the broad questions of numbers of systems that we're talking about have been handled. There are some exceptions, but I think by and large that part of the outcome is clear. But we certainly have a lot of work that could be done in the area of mobile missiles and the verification regime that would go with the system. As you know, we've been saying we think they ought to be banned. The Soviets have said no, they shouldn't be, and we've been saying, all right, it's got to then depend on not just an adequate but a fully satisfactory verification system. The leaders could look at that and perhaps give it a push.
This is an area in which the Soviet Union has many more such missiles than the United States.
Not only many more, but two kinds.
Two kinds,
yes.
Yeah. General Powell also said yesterday there's an opportunity to complete the task in President Reagan's term, meaning a START treaty in President Reagan's term. Does that depend on progress being made here? Because General Powell also said we need progress here.
I think it does. The three large issues of air-launched cruise missiles, a verification regime for mobile missiles if there are to be mobile missiles permitted, and how one deals with sea-launched cruise missiles, some progress must be made on those three very knotty issues, or one begins to lose time.
Some progress must be made here, or the prospect of reaching a START agreement while Mr. Reagan is still president
retreats much farther, yes.
If progress is made here in those areas, does that make more likely a fifth summit between these two men?
The fifth summit, which has certainly got a lot of gloss around it all of a sudden, and I think its origins are simply prudence, one doesn't discount the possibility of that, is something I'd really hate to speculate about. Certainly if you had a START agreement, it would be an appropriate occasion for a fifth summit. But that story of a fifth summit is taking on an awful lot more substance than I think it should have at the moment.
Is this going to be a summit at which nothing is signed?
There will be some things signed. I'm quite confident we will be able to sign a document of nearly 193 pages that governs some experiments in the field of verification for nuclear testing. A very important technical step, but one that had to be achieved, and I think we'll get that for this. We will have some agreements on transportation technology, a new comprehensive fishing agreement governing fishing activities of the two countries off each other's coasts. We have a range of agreements that Coast Guard has successfully negotiated on such things as radio navigation assistance and ocean pollution and the like. So I think we'll have some small agreements. We may even have a new cultural program for the next 3 years.
Turning to human rights, which the American side is billing as an important part of this summit, why has Mr. Reagan been blowing so hot and cold recently about apparent progress in human rights in the Soviet Union?
I don't have the impression he's blowing hot and cold. I have the impression he has been quite consistent throughout, saying we're prepared, excuse me, we're prepared to acknowledge progress. We're prepared to say immigration rates have increased since 1981, that families are being reunited, that some religious and political prisoners are being freed. But we must also call for a change in the standard, a change from an arbitrary decision to something that is predictable for citizens. And I think it's been quite consistent each time the president's addressed this in public.
Consistent for him to make a speech in Springfield, Massachusetts, which many interpreted as an attack on failure to make progress, followed by a big complaint from Mr. Gorbachev, followed by a speech in Chicago in which Mr. Reagan extraordinarily praises the progress, followed by a speech in Helsinki that is again, it would seem, and certainly the Soviets interpret it that way, back on the attack. Is that consistent?
I think there are themes throughout those 3 or 4 speeches, I guess 4 by now, that are consistent. And I would say, by the way, each speech had a different emphasis, and certainly the Helsinki speech was not exclusively a human rights speech. The most attention may have been given to that, but it was an attempt on the part of the president, I think a very successful one, to put human rights in the whole dimension of the four-part agenda.
The Soviet officials complained bitterly
Yes.
about that part of the Helsinki speech. How far does Mr. Reagan feel entitled, as President of the United States, to come here and to use the Soviet word lecture this country on how to organize its government? And
I don't think the president is lecturing. Others have said preaching. I don't think he's preaching. There are 35 countries that signed the Helsinki Final Act. They assumed a set of obligations or standards and said, we intend to live up to these. As a signatory to the Helsinki Final Act, looking at countries who've signed along with us, we have been saying we can speak out on an implementation record. We've been doing that now for nearly 13 years. And I think that while one might expect to hear the Soviet replies we have also been seeing, you must admit, some very interesting and some very forward-moving things in the Soviet Union, at least as far as language and potential is concerned.
On the so-called regional issues, the atmosphere of this summit was apparently in advance, greatly improved because of the Soviet beginning to withdraw from Afghanistan. Yes. Has that begun to sour again just in the last couple of days with the Soviet threat to stop withdrawing unless the United States stopped arming the rebels until after the Soviets have completed their assistance?
I'm aware of the statements that have been coming from Moscow in the last 2 or 3 days, but I have no sense of an impact, negative, in fact, either way, on the feeling as we come to Moscow that something important was achieved with respect to Soviet agreement to withdraw from Afghanistan and that will go forward.
Do you think, in view of perestroika, openness, Soviet public opinion, Mr. Gorbachev could stop withdrawing from Afghanistan?
I doubt very much that he could.
Finally, how do you see, just in symbolic terms, the significance of this president historically, this particular man and president, with all the things that he stood for in the past, making his first visit to this city?
Let me pick something that perhaps isn't quite so obvious, because I've heard some of the comparisons that are out there and they're rather largely drawn. But looking at it from where I sit dealing with policy over a long diplomatic career, I see his visit here as the symbol of the success of a dialogue that has changed, of a framework for a relationship that is new, a way of approaching the U.S.-Soviet relationship that has built on the experience of the past. And in the early years of it, I was serving in Europe. I can't think of a policy approach that was more misunderstood and more worried about. But we're at the end of a decade, we're in 1988, the success is apparent, and this puts the finishing touch to the fact that being realistic, staying strong, willing to talk, means that the United States and the Soviet have a way of getting together that should last well past the administration.
Ms. Ridgway, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
With us now to analyze the developments at the summit so far are two leading experts on the Soviet Union. Stephen Cohen is professor of Soviet politics and history at Princeton University. Michael Mandelbaum is director of the East-West Project on the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Mandelbaum, if they do pull out this little agreement on the missile launch notification issue, is that important?
No, it's not important. They had been hoping to make progress on more important issues. Now it seems they're going to be unable to do so. They want to agree on something, so they seem to be returning to this secondary issue so as to produce some sort of arms control agreement out of this summit.
Arms control agreement to whose benefit?
Well, it's to the benefit of both sides, but it really will not have much of an impact on the arsenals or the force postures of either.
What significance do you attach to this agreement if they do come up with one?
Well, the original hope was they would come here, sign an agreement to abolish 50% of these strategic missiles on both sides. The principle of abolishing weapons is a very important one at this stage in the arms race. But I'm becoming worried that all this talk, these details, this pace, is going to give way to a new kind of arms race as both sides frantically search for a way to replace the weapons that eventually they promise to throw away.
Why is the progress on START so modest, to say the least? Why is it taking so long after all the euphoria of the agreement in principle at the previous summit?
I think there are two reasons. First, there are a few knotty issues that are very difficult politically, having to do with sea-launched cruise missiles, mobile missiles, and of course the Strategic Defense Initiative. But beyond that, there's a looming question that people in the United States are only just beginning to discuss. If you can only have half as many weapons as you already have now, or really a third fewer, do you have the kinds of weapons that you need to make the balance stable? More and more people, I think, are coming to the conclusion that we don't. And therefore, a START agreement will necessitate a hard look at the American force posture and perhaps the building of new weapons, expensive new weapons, not so as to fuel the arms race, but so as to make the strategic balance more stable.
So it isn't only the Soviet Union that's dragging its feet on this one?
I think that in the end, it may be the United States that has more trouble with this agreement, simply because Americans will decide that under the START limits, we don't have the right sorts of weapons.
Stephen Cohen, turning to human rights. A Soviet official said after Mr. Reagan went to the American embassy and met the Soviet dissidents today, and we saw the excerpt earlier, Mr. Reagan showed bad political taste in doing that performance. What do you think?
Well, I think it's a subjective question. Americans themselves will have to decide. We have a principle in America that you don't go to somebody else's house and complain about the house or the food that's served. A certain element of politeness. I think the question is not whether the president had a right to do that, but whether we as Americans have the wisdom to intervene the way he is intervening in internal Soviet politics. Let me give you one example. We speak loosely of Soviet dissidents and a desire to help them. But I would say to you that I don't think most Americans know what a Soviet dissident is. They imagine that Soviet dissidents are all people who have liberal constitutional ideas as we do. But many of the people who are dissidents here, and maybe even the majority, in fact, have very right-wing, pogrom-like ideas. They just as soon hang Gorbachev as Mr. Reagan from the nearest flagpole. There's a small group of liberal dissidents here, but it's a very small group. In addition, there's a sizable group of people we call refuseniks, people who really aren't dissidents but just want to leave the country. These distinctions are very important in the Soviet Union.
Ms. Ridgway said in the interview we just saw that the United States was perfectly entitled to hold the Soviet Union to account to its promises under the Helsinki agreements and to point out when it failed to do so. What do you think about Mr. Reagan's, the appropriateness of Mr. Reagan lecturing the Soviets today?
Well, I suppose one person's firm affirmation of principle is another person's lecturing, but I think it was constructive for Mr. Reagan to speak as he did, for the following reason. Soviet-American relations can only improve to the extent that the American people are willing to support improvement. The plain lesson of the failure of détente in the 1970s is that the American public is extremely concerned about what it regards as human rights in the Soviet Union and will judge Soviet-American relations by that criteria. There's no point in trying to ignore it or sugarcoat it. These issues really count in Soviet-American relations, and although Mr. Reagan may have offended some of his hosts by raising it in precisely the way that he did, I think doing so made it clear that this is an issue that's going to be with us for the foreseeable future.
That may be Mr. Mandelbaum's view, and I think there are probably a number of Americans who would agree with that, but the polls don't support his perspective. Most polling on American attitudes toward the Soviet Union suggests that most Americans are primarily concerned about the nuclear weapons, not about what we call human rights in the Soviet Union. They're concerned about it, but not primarily.
This same Soviet official, Mr. Arbatov, said this evening that Mr. Reagan or his advisors were 3 to 4 years behind events here. In other words, you're not praising us enough for what we're doing. What do you think about that?
Well, a close friend of mine, a Soviet former dissident who sat 3 or 4 years in a concentration camp here, periodically calls Mr. Gorbachev the Soviet Union's main dissident at the moment. That is to say that he has made proposals that exceed the hopes, the wildest hopes of many dissidents, say 10, 15 years ago in this country. And he has created for himself, Mr. Gorbachev has many enemies here. Now, the changes are profound. at least in some areas. But the kind of changes Mr. Gorbachev is proposing are going to take many years to put in place, if they're ever put in place. But one thing is absolutely certain. It is not Mr. Reagan or the United States that will bring about changes in this country. It is the Soviet leadership, if there are going to be those kind of changes.
Do you agree with that? Or does Mr. Reagan help to bring about, or does the U.S. help to bring about changes here by continuing to harp on what it sees as violations of human rights?
We certainly should not labor under the illusion that we have extensive influence on what goes on in this country. Insofar as changes come about, and especially changes in the area of human rights, they will be generated from within the Soviet Union, and the main motivations will not be to please the United States. Nonetheless, I think it is useful to make it clear to the leadership of the Soviet Union that insofar as progress is made, that will underpin an improving Soviet-American relationship. That, I think, is what Mr. Reagan was trying to do, and I think he was right to try to do so.
Do you agree with Mr. Mandelbaum that a long-term improvement of U.S.-Soviet relations depends on the Soviets improving their human rights situation to American taste, or towards American taste? In other words, that the Kissinger policy of separating, of not linking the two, was what destroyed détente in the United States?
I don't fully agree. Let me give an unpopular answer.
Mr. Reagan is now relinking them.
Yeah, I understand. Let me give you an unpopular answer. The reality is that over the last 10 years, the two kinds of Soviet behavior that have most offended Americans has been Soviet behavior abroad, let's say in Afghanistan and elsewhere, and Soviet refusal to open the door for Jewish immigration. It's been those two kinds of behaviors that the American media has focused on, and thus the American political class. I would say that if the Soviet Union moves in a more liberal way on the immigration issue, that would probably satisfy American objections to Soviet behavior, more than anything.
I'd like to ask each of you quickly, we heard what Ms. Ridgway said the U.S. government expected from this summit. What do you expect from this summit, Michael Mandelbaum?
I don't expect extensive agreements, but I think this summit will be important because whatever Mr. Reagan said, through programs like this and the rest of the American media, the American public is going to see the changes that Mr. Gorbachev has made in the Soviet Union in 3 years. They are substantial and important.
What do you expect from the summit?
Let me avoid your question and give you an answer to another question. I think it's possible that what Mr. Reagan did by lecturing here on the human rights thing will hurt Mr. Gorbachev. In that, it confirms the prediction of Gorbachev's domestic enemies, that nothing the Soviet Union will do will ever satisfy the United States.
So your only expectation for this summit is a wound to Mr. Gorbachev?
I'm worried it might be. I think things will probably improve after today, but I'm a little worried about
What about what Ms. Ridgway discussed, the possibility of another summit? I mean, can enough happen here to justify these two leaders to schedule another summit before Mr. Reagan goes out of office?
If there is to be another summit, there will have to be a START treaty ready for signing. If there is to be a START treaty ready for signing, there will have to be a resolution of the three outstanding issues that I mentioned. I doubt that they can be resolved here, but if they are to be resolved by the time Mr. Reagan leaves office, there will probably have to be some impetus toward resolution in the next few days.
Which is essentially what she was saying earlier, yeah. Okay, Stephen Cohen, Michael Mandelbaum, thank you very much for joining us.
In addition to covering the summit, Robin has also spent some time exploring the real-life consequences thus far of those new Russian winds of change called perestroika and glasnost.
A Soviet bride and groom make the customary visit to be photographed in Red Square. What kind of Soviet Union will their children be born into? If it is the freer, more democratic, more humane state that Gorbachev promises, his reform may turn out to be one of the great events of the 20th century. So far, it is mostly words. Perestroika, meaning restructuring. Glasnost, meaning openness. But 3 years into this revolution, how does the reform show? What can a visitor to Moscow actually notice? Well, it shows in a couple of ways, physically and psychologically. Physically, there's been a sudden blossoming of new businesses to compete directly with the drab services run by the state. This is one of them, one of dozens of new cooperative restaurants that have sprouted recently. This Jewish restaurant opened only 2 days ago, and already it is booked until the end of June. Gorbachev has pushed the profit-making cooperatives to fill the acute need for goods and services. After heated debate, the Supreme Soviet passed the law, making it legal to compete with state enterprise only last week. This is another restaurant. There is no limit on the profit owners can make, but they'll pay taxes just like American businesses. The new competition is most obvious in Moscow's central food market, where there are now 3 kinds of enterprise: state, cooperative, and private. This is a private vendor. Where do you come from?
Я из Азербайджана.
Azerbaijan. And you fly?
Нет, не свою машину, приехал, свою машину выезжаю.
No, I've got a truck.
You come in a truck and you drive. That's a long drive.
Это очень далеко ехать.
2300 километров.
Простите.
2300 километров.
2,300 kilometers.
You drive 2,300 kilometers in your own truck?
Вот мы здесь двое его гоняем.
That's like driving from Kansas City to New York just to sell a truckload of vegetables. Where do you grow your vegetables?
Где вы выращиваете ваши овощи? In my garden.
How far is that from Moscow?
Это далеко от Москвы?
60 километров.
60 kilometers.
60 kilometers. How often do you come to town?
Как вы часто приезжаете в Москву?
В неделю раз. Бабки.
Once a week.
Бабки много будет есть, что тяжело.
It's difficult for me to...
How do you feel about the perestroika?
Что вы думаете о перестройке?
Ну что, мне кажется, все хорошо. Перестройка.
I think everything's fine.
Everything's fine? Is it better now than it was before?
Сейчас лучше, чем было раньше.
Конечно. Можно все везде купить, и все хорошо.
You can get hold of everything. Everything's fine.
What you can get? I didn't understand. You can get what more of everything?
Можно больше купить или можно все купить?
Можно и не больше по потребности. Кому сколько нужно, кому сколько требуется, столько покупаем.
You can get hold of everything you need.
Thank you.
Спасибо.
Let's talk to these. Can we ask you some questions about your market? This is very beautiful produce you have.
Разрешите вам несколько вопросов задать. Это замечательные товары, которые вы привезли. Замечательные продукты.
Конечно, это товар высшей продукции. Видите, какой свежий. Все, что с огорода.
Very fresh.
Straight from the garden.
Straight from the garden. Where is the garden? Where is it grown?
Откуда вы это привезли?
Это с Еревана.
Yerevan, Armenia.
From Armenia. So how long ago did this leave Armenia?
Когда вы это привезли из Армении?
У нас дорога 2 часа самолетом. Вечером собираем, утром уже на рынке.
Last evening they set off.
Last evening, and what, you drove?
No, by plane.
By plane. It came by plane.
Yes.
How has your life changed since the perestroika began?
Как изменилась ваша жизнь, когда началась перестройка?
Вроде к лучшему все идет.
For the better. How?
For the better.
How is it for the better?
Но как к лучшему?
Как сейчас объяснить? Всего хватает.
Now we're allowed to do everything.
Allowed to do everything?
Yes.
What are you allowed to do now that you couldn't do before?
Это самое дорогое здесь. У нас там дешевле. Вот по ту сторону дешевле, а тут очень
The
дорого.
most expensive. It's much cheaper there.
Yeah.
Вы там спрашиваете цены. Там у нас дешево, а эти берут очень дорого.
They charge people too much.
They charge people too much.
Да.
Yeah. So you shop on the other side.
Да, а там дешево. Мы у них
Cheap
не
there.
покупаем.
Don't do shopping here.
Don't do shopping here.
Yeah.
Right. Her prices are high. Her cucumbers, flown from Armenia, are 4 rubles a kilo. Across the aisle in the state market, cucumbers are only 1.5 rubles. But the state-produced goods lack the variety, freshness, and quality of privately grown produce. We're interested in knowing how you see the prices and the quality of things since the perestroika program began.
Хотим спросить вас про изменение в ценах после того, как началась перестройка в Советском Союзе на рынке.
На рынке никакого изменения нет.
No changes in the market.
No changes?
It's very expensive there.
Very expensive there?
Very expensive.
Кооператив дорогой.
Cooperative prices are very expensive. No change.
No change? The prices changed here too?
Изменились ли здесь цены на государственных магазинах?
Нет.
Falling in between, in both price and quality, are the cooperatives. Here, the cucumbers are $2.20 a kilo.
The quality is excellent.
Is it an improvement to have these?
Вы думаете, что качество улучшилось с началом перестройки? Качество улучшилось, но цены, конечно, тоже соответствующие. Yeah, the quality is better now, but prices are higher.
Prices are higher. Do you feel perestroika changing your life directly?
Вы думаете, что перестройка меняет вашу жизнь? Вашу личную жизнь? Лично? Пока не ощущаю, что она меняет. No, I don't have this feeling.
But this makes a difference. This kind of store makes a difference.
Но вы думаете, что эти кооперативные магазины, они все-таки какое-то изменение? Вносят изменения? Видимо, заставят государственные лучше работать. They'll make state shops work better.
They will make the state shops work better. How will they do that?
Каким образом?
Как, видимо, когда-то они выйдут на такой режим работы, что создадут конкуренцию большую совхозам, чтобы те думали о своей продукции лучше.
Collective farms will have to compete with cooperatives, so collective farms will start working better.
Well, thank you, sir.
Спасибо большое.
Competition has even penetrated that austere bastion of the state monopoly, the vast department store GUM on Red Square. A cooperative clothing store has been given space here to market trendier clothes and better service. The government gave the owners a startup loan. Is it going to be a success financially, do you think?
Yes.
Can you tell yet?
Yeah. Well, approximately. We're working from the beginning of February, and approximately we have about, the pure profit is about 90,000.
Really? Now, what will you do with that profit? Do you just keep it for yourselves, or do you reinvest it in the business?
No, we shall invest certainly. We shall invest because we have an opportunity to expand our trade.
How are you going to do that?
Well, I mean that perhaps we may build another shop. Yeah, without any rent. We shall build it ourselves. Maybe we shall receive another. We think about and just organize another points of trade in different parts of the city. And we have right to receive goods from all the regions of the USSR. And we know that some goods are made better in that region or in this, and that market is already supplied fully. And that's why, and here the people are unsatisfied with this sort of goods, you know.
Can you import goods from abroad?
Till now, no.
No.
We didn't make it. But it will be a good business, I'm sure.
The store is so popular, it has to let customers in a few at a time. So the line, the perennial symbol of Soviet shortages, can now mean hope, not despair. For example, these people are queuing outside a state clothing store because it is responding to competition by selling smarter, better-made clothes. So on the material, physical side, you can see the new policy making a tiny improvement in the chronic failure of the Soviet system to supply basic consumer needs. The same wind of competition is supposed to blow through heavy industry and politics, contested elections for factory bosses and party leaders. Then we come to the psychological impact of reform. Fear has always played some part in Russian life, almost part of the national metabolism. Awareness of an arbitrary power wielded from the Kremlin, sometimes as cruelly by the communists as it was by the czars. Now one senses that fear may be ebbing out of the Soviet psyche, but imperceptibly, like a tide just beginning to turn. Certainly, people are willing to talk in public.
Я с ним в одном согласен, в том, что вот я молодой человек.
One at a time. One at a time. Just a moment. What is this lady saying?
пожалуйста,
Перестройка никак не отразилась на простом человеке, абсолютно никак.
Ну куда результат?
Перестройка.
Я не знаю. Причем
Только
такое
цены
ощущение,
вздулись, в 10 раз все стало дороже.
Перестройка hasn't affected
А зарплата все та же.
common people. They just raised prices and wages are the same.
А зарплата все та же.
Same wages.
Свободы никакой.
No freedom.
Абсолютно.
Absolutely no freedom.
Границы закрыты.
Borders closed.
Границы закрыты.
What do you mean the
Нет, тут,
body,
ну,
the
тут
body's
политика.
closed? The border?
Нет, тут экономическая политика. Пусть откроют, но что вы там будете делать? Без гроша в кармане или что-нибудь повезете с собой продавать туда? А что здесь, если мы не можем поменять советские деньги на валюту? Нет, это вопрос открытой границы, это очень сложный. Очень сложный. Экономический вопрос.
A gentleman said it's a very difficult problem because what we're going to do abroad without money, without currency. And
the lady said the border is closed, so is that what she said? I see.
Yeah, and she said, I'll do the same thing I'm doing here.
The young woman is very outspoken.
Потому что дело в том, что в пределах социализма ничего нельзя сделать.
Nothing will work under socialism. This is the Arbat, a district that has long been a center for Moscow intellectuals and artists. One artist sells wall plaques satirizing some of the slogans of perestroika and those who oppose it.
Well, everywhere, in every office, you may find people for whom perestroika is something they are afraid of. And, well, there are millions of people who don't like perestroika to go far enough to change something and to, because they'll find danger there.
What danger?
Their jobs, their way of life. That's why they are against it.
Or do they fear that it may be a campaign for some years and then the whole thing will change?
Well, I think you're right. A lot of people believe it's just a campaign for 3 years, 5 years. Even my own father, he's a communist, and I'm not. He believes that it's just a short-lived campaign, just to maybe just to cheat people, to cheat the intellectuals who want something to be changed, who want the political life to be reformed,
do you believe
who want more rights.
Do you think your father's right?
No.
You don't?
I don't. He's absolutely wrong.
You think the country needs perestroika
Yes,
because it needs the political
Sure.
reforms to make
Sure,
the
it
economic
needs.
reforms?
Yes. Political reforms in first place. If not political reforms as such, but more human rights. No. Just ordinary human rights for the people who lack it.
But even people in the food markets, where the daily frustrations of Soviet life have been most obvious, are just as outspoken about the political side of perestroika.
What can I say? Some people are pleased with perestroika and some people are not sure because it's difficult to fulfill everything in 1-2 years. We have difficulties. We have achievements already.
Было как бы две таких морали. Одна для общего обозрения, другая для себя. А теперь у нас все соединилось. И это самые главные достижения.
During stagnation period, we had two morals. One official moral and a second for internal use only. And now they became the same.
So you could say one thing outside and another thing inside the house, and now you can say the same thing. Is that what he's saying?
То есть вы могли раньше дома говорить одно, а на улице официально другое. А теперь это одно и то стало одним и
А теперь
то же.
это стало одно и то же. Это соединилось. В этом суть той перестройки, и мы надеемся, что так будет теперь и впредь.
That's the essence of perestroika, and we hope it will be the same in the future.
There is still fear.
А я повторю, меня заберут и не выпустят.
Нет, вас не будут забирать.
Ну, я боюсь.
She's scared.
Yeah.
Боюсь,
Why
заберут.
is
I'm
she
afraid to be
scared?
arrested.
Afraid to be arrested.
They won't let me. They won't release me because I speak the truth.
Защиты нет.
All right.
I don't have.
Поняли? Ничего нет в магазине.
There's nothing in shops.
Where does she come from?
From the provinces.
From the provinces, and she said there's nothing
I
in the
came
shop.
to Moscow to buy sugar. because our children and we don't have sugar in the provinces. And there is nothing in our shops, and I'm afraid I'll be arrested and they won't release me because I don't have support. I don't have relatives.
She was not the only one who didn't want to talk.
Yes, please. Oh, no, I'm not going to speak to you.
Okay. But in those who did, it was fascinating to hear the first stirrings of Soviet democracy.
Я прошла войну. Война кончилась. Послевоенное время, понимаете, тяжелое. И впервые за эти 40 лет я почувствовала себя человеком. Когда я могу сказать, что я хочу. Когда я могу работать, где я хочу. Если мне маленький оклад, я могу вступить в кооператив. Понимаете?
Разрешите, я переведу,
Пожалуйста.
When I was 16, I went to fight in the Second World War, and over 40 years, it's the first time I feel myself a human being. Now I can work where I want to. If I have little salary, I can change my job. I can say what I think.
And you could not say what you thought before.
Но раньше вы не могли сказать, что вы думаете.
Не могла.
No, I couldn't.
Я не могла этого сказать.
I couldn't say that.
Вот. Мой муж прослужил на Байконуре с самого начала.
My husband worked at Baikonur.
И когда он увольнялся из армии, он получил 17 выговоров партийных. Из них 7 с внесением в учетную карточку. Только за то, что он любил высказать свои демократические мысли.
He was a free thinker, and for this he was reprimanded 17 times over his career.
Сейчас моего мужа нет, к сожалению. Он уже умер. Но если бы он был жив, он бы счастлив был, увидя все это.
He would have been happy.
He would have been happy about perestroika.
About perestroika and glasnost.
Вы знаете, я лично готова перед Горбачевым встать на колени за то, что он все это дело всколыхнул и поднял. И дал людям абсолютно полную свободу слова и действий. Понимаете?
I'm ready to kneel in front of Gorbachev because he gave people freedom of action and thought.
Да.
Talk is still the chief product of the Gorbachev reforms. Translating that talk into the more humane, democratic, and productive nation Gorbachev apparently wants will be an enormous task. Some think it impossible in a society which rewards the opposite behavior: conformism, silence, suspicion, loyalty. It will be resisted on many grounds, not least that Western materialism will corrupt the communist ideals, personified by Lenin and still venerated. On a warm spring day, new brides still follow the tradition of laying flowers on Lenin's tomb.
Finally tonight, some thoughts on the Memorial Day holiday from essayist Roger Rosenblatt.
Americans are said to possess no memory, but the evidence shouts to the contrary. The plaques, the statues, the museums, cities named for national leaders: Jackson, Lincoln, Washington, D.C. The nation's capital is one enormous monument to memory, a collection of obelisks and presidents on thrones and generals on horses rearing up among the formal portraits, the artifacts and inventions, the historical buildings. It's the same the country over. In every small town, life continually preserved, from the Grange Hall to the Town Hall to stories told on porches. In big city New York, Broadway musicals are revived every year. Historic districts made sacrosanct. Old ships made shipshape. Upstate, a cheese museum was established recently, a rock of aging. Remember the Alamo? Remember the Maine? Remember the war dead. That is what one does on Memorial Day, which is as much a celebration of memory as an homage to heroes. The parades to memory. The flags of memory. The main streets of the nation suddenly snatched away from their present commerce and turned over to the past. The air suddenly filled with images of people, no longer corporeal, but real nonetheless. A husband or wife, son or daughter, imagined as they were, out of uniform, in the backyard swinging or waving from the seat of a station wagon, or graduating from high school wearing a too tight collar. It is the imagination that keeps Memorial Days alive. Contradictorily, memory relies on the imagination, the mind creating the past by an act of loving concentration. Main Street was empty, now it is heaving with marchers. The air was empty, now it is full of wars. Not that many, really, not compared with Europe, but worth remembering. A revolution, a war of 1812, our deadly Civil War, the Spanish-American War, and the great, inexplicable First World War, and the great, quite explicable Second World War. Korea, hidden and terrible. Vietnam, most recently, commemorated by a black wall of names, each containing a house of memories, as every name contains a house of memories. When a person dies, a civilization dies inside him. His politics die, his art, his landscape dies. All that the person contained is as dead as all that he or she would have become. All the unrecorded life that he and she ever thought or dreamed, that too is dead. The mysteries contemplated in bed at night, the ambitions, the logical conclusions reached, the memories too, every activity that ever stirred in the individual you recollect, dead as a doornail. Unrealized thoughts in unrealized persons, dead. And with them, America dead. The land scorched and vacant in bodies of countrymen no longer visible. Until an assertion of will makes them visible and felt again, even their unrealized possibilities resurrected. Amazing that memory can revive that too, the picture of the possibilities. Americans are said to possess no memory, but in a way memory is all that we possess. We seize so many occasions to understand ourselves by remembering all that we have been. On Memorial Day, we remember that we have been soldiers who believed sufficiently in their country to lay their lives on the line. We remember that by remembering them, who were the country in themselves, and who now lie still like a vast underground continent, waiting to be reclaimed. Memory is how we reclaim them, whose lives are ours.
Again, the major news of this Memorial Day was mostly the second day of the Moscow summit. President Reagan and Soviet leader Gorbachev were reportedly talking in earnest about further arms control agreements. Mr. Reagan also made some waves by meeting with a group of Soviet dissidents and telling them to have hope because freedom will truly come to all. And there was more death in Lebanon. 20 persons died and at least 78 others were hurt when a car bomb exploded in a Christian section of Beirut. Have a nice holiday evening. We'll see you tomorrow night. I'm Jim Lehrer. Thank you and good night.
Funding for the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour is provided by AT&T, combining everything people like about telephones with everything they expect from computers to make everything about information easy. AT&T. Funding is also provided by this station and other public television stations, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.